The wind curled low along the prairie like a lost whisper looking for a name. It carried the dust of dry seasons and sorrow, and it found 3 girls tied to a fence no one cared about. The rails were gray and splintered, leaning as though tired from too many storms. On that fence, the girls hung like forgotten coats, one tall and still as stone, one squirming and sharp-eyed, and one so small her feet didn't touch the ground when she swung. Their father had tied them there just before sundown, using a length of hemp rope and a voice so hollow it didn't echo. He hadn't promised he'd come back. He hadn't said anything at all. The eldest girl, just past 20, bore the silence the way others bore scars, without complaint but never unmarked. Her hands had stopped fighting the rope hours ago. Instead, they rested in her lap, palms open as if she'd been praying and lost the words halfway through. Her hair was the color of creaked clay, pulled into a tight braid that had come undone in pieces, like her hope. The middle sister, barely 16, cursed under her breath every few minutes, pulling against the rope with the anger of someone who hadn't yet given up on the world disappointing her. Her wrists were rubbed raw. Her voice, sharp and ready, echoed off the empty fields like a stone skipped on a dead lake. The youngest, maybe 8 or 9, whimpered only when the wind got cold enough to sneak past her collar. Her lips moved in little circles, humming songs no one taught her, just melodies made from memory and fear. They would have died there, if not for the horse. It came limping up the trail with a gait like regret, uneven and stubborn. Its rider leaned forward, tall and knotted like a tree that had survived too many winters. His coat was dark with dust, his hat low over his brow, and his jaw set hard enough to chisel marble. Coulter Hayes didn't look like a savior. He looked like the kind of man who would ride past the bleeding sky and call it just weather. He saw them before they saw him. 3 shapes tied to a fence didn't need much interpreting. He slowed his horse not out of curiosity, but calculation. The sorrel gelding beneath him stumbled again, one shoe lost to the rocky trail. He sighed. Deep and tired. Dismounted. The girls said nothing at first. Neither did he. He walked up slowly, eyes narrowed beneath the brim. His voice when it came was dry as would smoke. "Where's your father?" The eldest met his gaze. Her voice was even, low. "Gone." "For how long?" "Long enough." Coulter looked them over with a scowl that wasn't anger, just habit. His eyes lingered on the youngest, whose lips trembled from cold. Her little boots were cracked. One had no sole. "You runaways?" The middle girl spat to the side. "He tied us. We ain't runnin' from nothin'." "He ran." "Why?" The eldest answered again, slow and careful. "Didn't say. But he took his whiskey bottle. So I guess he took what he came for." Coulter grunted and looked away, as if the sight of them was something he'd rather not swallow. He walked back to his horse, opened one of his saddlebags, and pulled out a flask. He unscrewed the top, sniffed it, water, not whiskey, and brought it back. He handed it to the youngest first. She looked up at him, eyes wide and blinking. "Sir? You got a bit of water for my baby sister?" she asked, voice too small for the big sky above them. That did it. He knelt beside her, held the flask to her lips, and said nothing. She drank like a bird, quick, afraid it might vanish. Then he took out his knife and cut the ropes. He started with the little one, then the middle, then the eldest. She stood on her own once free, her hands raw and rope-bitten. She didn't say thank you. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because she knew men like him didn't take kindly to thanks. It might make them feel like they owed something. "What's your name?" he asked the eldest. She paused, just a beat too long. "Clara." He nodded once. "You can walk?" "All of us can." He looked down at his horse. "She can't carry 4. We'll walk." He didn't argue. They followed him in silence for the first mile, dust rising behind them like old ghosts. The sun sank further, and the air took on that chill that bites deepest when you've already been worn thin. Coulter didn't look back, not once. But he heard the smallest girl hum. And for some reason, it stayed in his ears longer than the wind. The homestead appeared like a scar on the land, functional but not beautiful. A single-story cabin, lopsided barn, and a split-rail corral. No flowers. No porch swing. Just a place that stood because it hadn't yet fallen. He opened the door. The girls filed in. The inside was bare, one cot, one stove, one table. The rest was air and dust. He lit a lamp, handed the matches to Clara, and said, "Make heat if you can. Wood's in the corner." He pulled a tin of beans from the shelf and dropped it on the table. "That's supper. You work, you eat. Don't steal, don't lie. Don't expect much else." The middle sister narrowed her eyes. "We ain't beggars." "Good," he said without looking at her. "I ain't a saint." He left them there, took his tools to the barn, and didn't speak another word that night. Inside, Clara stoked the stove, her hands trembling from the cold and the heat both. She ladled beans into tin bowls and passed them around. The youngest sat close to her side, resting her head on Clara's arm. The middle girl, whom the others called Ruth, watched the door like it might betray them. No one cried. No one laughed. They simply survived. When the wind howled louder, the youngest shivered and said, "Will he be nice tomorrow?" Clara didn't answer right away. She looked toward the window, where the shadows of fence posts danced in moonlight. Then softly, as if not speaking to anyone at all, she murmured, "Nice isn't what we need. Safe is enough." And in the barn, Coulter stared at the ceiling, haunted by the fact that her words echoed something he'd once said to himself. Long ago. Before graves. Before fences. Before he stopped believing anyone could be saved from what they were left to. Morning came soft as ash and just as cold. The prairie was still, but inside Coulter's house, the tension moved like smoke, quiet, unseen, curling into corners. The three sisters had taken the far wall, laying old quilts between themselves and the splintered floor. They hadn't asked for beds, and he hadn't offered. Coulter moved about the kitchen with the grace of a man who never learned to share a room. He boiled coffee, stirred oats, and said nothing. His boots thudded against wood worn thin by years of pacing alone. He wasn't used to the sound of breathing that wasn't his. Clara sat with her knees drawn up, wrapping a shawl around the youngest. Her name, as Coulter had learned without asking, was Lottie. She always seemed to be shivering, even when the fire was warm. Ruth, the middle one, had found a broom and swept the ashes out from beneath the stove without being told. She moved fast, with an edge, like she was always prepared for a door to slam shut again. They didn't speak to Coulter much, but they watched him. He noticed it in the way Clara's eyes followed his boots when he passed, like she was trying to measure the weight of his steps. Ruth stared at his hands, maybe to see if they curled into fists the way their fathers had. Lottie watched his face, not for kindness, but for warning. She was too young to hide her fear, too old to believe in fairy tales. By midday, Coulter hitched up the wagon and motioned for Ruth to come along. "Town 6 miles. Feed store first." She hesitated, wiped her hands on her skirt, and climbed up beside him. They didn't speak for the first mile. Just the clatter of the wheels, the creak of the seat, and the wind moving through grass that bent like prayer. After a while, Ruth said, "You always this quiet?" Coulter kept his eyes ahead. "Don't like wasting words. You don't like people much either." "Nope." She gave a small snort, half amused. "We ain't staying forever, if that's what you're worried about." "I ain't worried." She looked out at the hills, jaw clenched. "Pa used to say quiet men got the loudest tempers. That true?" "No." "You ever hit a woman?" Coulter turned to her then, slow, deliberate. "I buried one. I don't hit 'em." That ended the questions. When they got to town, Ruth stayed close but didn't cling. People stared. 3 sisters left by a drunk father wasn't new, but being taken in by Coulter Hayes? That was unexpected. Folks knew him as the man who never smiled, never lingered, never forgave. At the general store, Ruth handled the coins, choosing flour and lye soap and nails with the instinct of someone who'd had to make do before. Coulter said nothing, only nodded when she asked if dried beans were cheaper than salt pork. Back at the homestead, Clara had hung laundry along the back fence. Lottie sat beneath it, playing with pebbles in the dirt, arranging them in strange, swirling patterns. That evening, Clara cooked biscuits from scratch, thin gravy, and black coffee strong enough to scrape the rust off a man's thoughts. Coulter watched her work. She moved like someone used to being unseen, quiet, efficient, gentle. When she burned her finger, she didn't flinch. Just dipped it in water and kept stirring. He wondered, not for the first time, what kind of home had taught her that pain wasn't worth reacting to. They ate in near silence. The clink of spoons and the scrape of forks. Lottie made a face at the bitterness of the coffee, and Ruth smirked. Clara watched them both with a mother's eyes, though she wasn't their mother. Not really. After supper, Coulter went out to chop wood. Not because it needed doing, he'd done it the day before, but because his hands didn't know what else to do. The swing of the axe, the crack of log, the rhythm of repetition. That was the language he understood. Inside, Clara cleared the table. Ruth washed. Lottie dried. They didn't talk about where they'd come from or where they'd go. Just moved like parts of a machine built to survive. Later that night, with the wind rising again and the moon sharp as a coin in the sky, Clara knocked softly at the barn door. Coulter was inside, checking on a mare due to foal. She stood at the threshold, not crossing in. "The roof leaks over the cot," she said, voice low. "Lottie's coughing." He nodded, wiped his hands on a rag. "I'll patch it tomorrow. She's small. Don't take much for cold to settle. I'll see to it." She hesitated. He didn't fill the silence. "You never asked what happened to our ma," Clara said after a pause. Coulter leaned against the post. "Don't figure it's my place. She died in spring. Pa drank through summer. By fall, he was meaner than the cold." He said nothing. Clara's voice thinned to a whisper. "It wasn't sudden. Just wore her down." Still, he said nothing. But she wasn't asking for answers, just to be heard. She turned to go. Then paused. "We'll earn our keep. But if you mean to send us away when the snow comes, I'd rather know now." Coulter looked at her then, truly looked. The tired curve of her shoulders, the small burns on her arms, the soft strength she wore like a second skin. "You're not Charity," he said finally. "I don't take in strays. I take in hands." She nodded, accepting that. It wasn't kindness, but it was clear. And it was something. As she left, he looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, shaking just a little. He hadn't touched a woman's hand since burying his wife 5 winters ago. Not even by accident. But something about Clara made him remember warmth without guilt. Inside the house, Ruth settled Lottie beneath extra quilts. Clara braided the girl's hair back, humming something soft. A lullaby with no name. Lottie, drowsy but curious, asked, "Is he gonna keep us?" Clara kissed her forehead. "He doesn't believe in keeping. But he believes in fixing things. Might be enough." And outside, Coulter leaned against the barn door, eyes fixed on the moon, wondering why the house had never felt heavier than now, heavy not with sorrow, but with presence. With the sound of life pressing up against his walls. He didn't smile. But when he looked at the roof, he made a silent promise. Before the next frost, he'd fix the leak. Not because he was asked, but because the sound of that child coughing didn't sit right in a house already full of ghosts. The storm came sudden, uninvited, like most trouble in the West. One minute the sky was only sullen, the next, it cracked open with a roar and spilled cold fury across the plains. Coulter saw it coming from the fields, gray sweeping in like a ghost with a bone to pick. He dropped the hoe, grabbed his coat, and turned for the barn. Clara was already moving, quiet, focused, gathering the chickens into the coop. Ruth pulled the wash from the line with quick hands, fists clenched against the wind. But Lottie, too light for sense, had run to the barn to watch the goats huddle in the hay. No one saw her slip. By the time Coulter reached the barn, the air was thick with dust and water. The wind screamed through the slats. A low bleat came from inside, followed by the sharp sound of splintered wood. Lottie had been trying to shut the side gate, the one that caught when it swelled in the rain. It had kicked back hard. She was sprawled on the ground, one foot twisted beneath her, crying soundlessly, mouth open against the wind. Then Clara was there. Not hesitating. Not screaming. Just moving. She shoved past Coulter, boots skidding in the mud. She scooped Lottie up in one arm, shielded her with the other, and took the brunt of a fallen beam that came loose from the loft in that same breath. It caught her shoulder and raked down her back. She didn't fall. She didn't even cry out. Coulter crossed the distance in 2 strides. His hands found Clara's elbow and steadied her before she could sway. He took Lottie gently, cradled her against his chest like something fragile. Clara followed on her own 2 feet, but barely. Inside, Ruth slammed the door shut behind them, teeth bared like a cornered animal. She was supposed to stay inside. I wanted to see the baby goats. Lottie whimpered. Reckless, Ruth snapped. You could have broken your dam. That's enough, Clara said, her voice low but firm. She sank into the nearest chair, clutching her arm. Blood bloomed beneath her sleeve. Coulter set Lottie on the cot and stepped into the kitchen. When he returned, he held a cloth, a tin of salve, and his flask. He knelt in front of Clara without ceremony. Let me see, he said. She hesitated. I've seen worse, he added, not unkindly. So she turned her shoulder. He peeled back the fabric. The gash was long, not deep, but angry with dirt. He poured whiskey over it. She flinched once. That was all. He cleaned it slow, fingers surprisingly gentle. Then came the salve, the bandage. The girls watched from the edges of the room, unsure whether to be grateful or afraid. You didn't have to go in after her, he said finally. Clara met his eyes. She's a child. She's not yours. Clara's lips twitched, the beginning of something like a smile. She is now. He didn't answer. Just nodded once, like that was a fact he could live with. The rain battered the roof like fists for the rest of the night. Later, after supper, bread and potatoes and not much else, Clara sat by the fire. Her shoulder throbbed, her braid was frayed, and her eyes looked older than her years. Coulter brought a bowl of broth and placed it in her hands without a word. She glanced at him. You feeding all your hired hands like this? No. He settled into the chair opposite her, pulled off his boots, and stared into the fire. You ever been shot? She asked. Twice. Which hurt more? He looked at her, long and level. The one I gave myself. Clara didn't ask what he meant. Some stories were best left in the dark. But she studied him in the flicker of firelight. His face was all hard lines, the kind carved by wind and regret. But his hands resting on his knees looked different tonight. Not clenched. Not prepared for war. Just resting. You weren't always like this, she said softly. He looked away. Don't know what I was. You had someone once. I can see it in how you listen. You're not good at talking. But you listen like you're starving. He blinked slowly, like the words landed somewhere deep. She died? Clara asked, not a question, not really. He nodded. Winter took her. Fever first, then snow. I'm sorry. Don't be. That was a lifetime ago. But it still lives in you. He didn't deny it. Silence settled between them, not heavy, but complete. The kind that only exists between two people who've carried something too long alone. Outside, the rain eased. The storm lost its teeth. Clara sipped her broth. Thank you? For earlier. You needed passion. That's all. No, she said. It wasn't just the bandage. You saw us. You came back. He shook his head. Didn't plan to. But you did. That meant something. More than either of them said out loud. The fire popped. Lottie snored softly from the cot. Ruth leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, pretending not to listen. You know, Clara said after a while, I used to think safety meant not being hurt. And now? Now I think it means knowing someone will help you stand up again. He nodded slowly. Sounds right. She smiled then, small and tired but real. Coulter stood. You should rest. I will. As he turned, she said, You don't talk much. But when you do, you don't lie. That's rare. He paused at the doorway. The firelight caught the edge of his face, softened it. I ain't got room for lying, he said. Then he disappeared into the dark. Clara sat alone for a while longer, watching the fire burn low. Her arm throbbed, her bones ached, but her heart, oddly, felt steadier than it had in years. She looked at the bowl in her hands. Empty now. Clean. Not much. But it had been offered freely. A first kindness. Unexpected. Undeserved. And maybe, just maybe, not the last. The heat came early that week. Not from the sun, which rose pale and half-hearted, but from somewhere far off, an unease in the air, like smoke that hadn't yet touched the nose but made the throat tighten anyway. Even the animals felt it. The goats stayed close to the fence line. The mare shifted her weight more than usual. Birds flew low, too quiet for spring. Coulter rose before dawn, as he always did, and walked the edge of the fields. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that something didn't sit right in the wind. The earth was dry beneath his boots, brittle. Clara had said just the night before that her dreams had turned restless again, full of hoofbeats and hollering voices. He hadn't asked what she meant. He never did. Inside the cabin, Clara folded linens while Lottie read aloud from a water-stained almanac. Ruth sharpened a paring knife, over and over, like the fruit she'd cut later might strike back. The morning passed slow, uneventful, and brittle as dried bone. It was noon when the knock came, hard, fast, twice. Not the hesitant kind they were used to. Coulter opened the door, and a man stood there in town-bought boots, slick with dust. Tall, pale, mouth pulled too tight. Badge on his vest, but the wrong shine. Looking for 3 girls, he said before Coulter could ask. Runaways. Coulter didn't blink. They ain't runaways. They got a father in Dry Bend says different. Man who left 'em tied to a fence don't get to make claims. The man smiled like a blade. You think that's your call? I think this is my land. Behind him, Ruth stepped into view. Her eyes went flat. That's not a lawman. That's one of Pa's drinking friends. I seen him before. The man's hand slid to his belt. They're underage. You keeping them here, cowboy? Coulter's jaw flexed. You got papers? The man hesitated. Then get off my land. The wind shifted. So did the man's smile. Be seeing you. He rode off without another word. Clara appeared beside Coulter. Her eyes followed the dust trail down the road. He'll come back. Not alone, maybe. She nodded. We should go. No. You don't owe us this. Ain't about debt. She looked at him then, truly looked, saw the set of his shoulders, the quiet fury under his skin. You think you can stop him? I know I can try. The tension didn't fade after that. It grew. It crawled into the seams of the house, sat at their supper table, lingered near the fire. Lottie grew quiet. Ruth stayed outside longer, always carrying something sharp. Clara cleaned things that didn't need cleaning. On the 3rd night, after another too silent supper, Clara stepped outside and found Coulter oiling his rifle on the porch. She sat beside him without asking. I used to think fear was loud, she said. Screaming, doors slammed, fists. He said nothing. But real fear's quiet. It's in the way your hands don't shake but your stomach turns. It's in how the wind sounds too close. He looked at her. You scared now? She nodded. A little. He set the rifle down gently. Good. Means you know what's coming. And if we don't leave? He exhaled, long and low. Then we don't run. She didn't argue. Why? She asked. Because you've run enough. The moon climbed high that night, casting silver across the prairie. The sisters slept close together, quilts pulled to their chins. Coulter stood at the window until dawn broke, rifle across his chest, eyes on the road. Nothing came. Not yet. The next day, Coulter rode into town alone. He came back with extra feed, lamp oil, another rifle, and news. Word is, he told Clara, their father's bragging in the saloon. Says he'll come get what's his by week's end. What did the sheriff say? Said he's seen worse than a drunk yelling in a bar. Clara's mouth tightened. He won't protect us. No. But I will. That night, Clara found herself at the edge of the barn, watching the light spill from the house. She thought of all the places they'd hidden, all the sheds, church basements, and strangers' backrooms. All the nights she'd held her sisters close and prayed their father's voice wouldn't find them. Now they were standing still for the first time. And the fire was coming. Coulter found her there, arms crossed, wind tugging at her braid. You still thinking of running? No. Why? Because this time, someone would notice we were gone. She turned to face him. You changed, Coulter. He shook his head. No. Just remembered what it felt like to care if someone ate. If they were warm. If they smiled. She stepped closer. That's not nothing. He met her gaze. For a moment, the world held still. He's dangerous, she whispered. So am I, he said, softer than wind. They stood there in the half-dark, two people who'd learned to survive by not needing anyone, suddenly needing each other more than they'd admit. I don't want revenge, Clara said. I just want peace. He nodded. Then we make this place peaceful. Even if we gotta fight for it. She placed a hand on his arm. Just that. No more. But it lingered warm, steady. That was the first time Coulter let himself lean into her touch. Just a little. Later, as the lanterns dimmed and the girls tucked into sleep, Clara lay awake listening to the wind shift. But it didn't sound like fear anymore. It sounded like the hush before something right begins. And in the barn, Coulter tightened the bolts on the door, checked the rifle once more, and whispered to the wood. I ain't losing another home. Far off, across the prairie, a fire flickered. Not yet close, but coming. And this time, it would find them ready. The sun had barely cracked the horizon when the sound of hooves broke the calm. Not distant like before. Not a warning whispered on wind. This was real, near, and angry. The kind of sound that brought memories with it, splintered doors, raised voices, the stink of whiskey and sweat. Clara heard it first. She was at the stove, turning biscuits when her spine went stiff. Coulter was already moving, loading shells into his rifle with slow, steady hands. Ruth grabbed the knife from the table. Lottie crawled under the cot without needing to be told. A wagon kicked up dust at the fence line. A tall figure jumped off before the wheels stopped spinning. The father. The same shoulders. Same hat. But thinner now, meaner, hollowed from the inside out like a rotted tree. He shouted Clara's name before his boots hit the porch. She didn't flinch. She'd heard it in nightmares for years. Behind him stood two men, either from town. Hired hands, likely paid in liquor and promises. They looked bored but ready. Coulter stepped out onto the porch, rifle resting easy in his arms. You're not welcome here. The father scoffed. Ain't your decision. Them's my girls. They're not property. They're blood. That means they're mine. Coulter didn't blink. They're people. And they're staying. One of the hired men shifted his coat to show a pistol. Clara stepped outside then, calm as rain. She didn't speak. Just stood beside Coulter. Ruth followed, standing on his other side. Three people who had known too much fear to ever run from it again. You want to talk, Coulter said, voice even. You want to fight, I don't miss. The father laughed, a sharp, sour thing. You playing husband now? Clara's voice came, quiet and clear. I'm not property either. He turned to her, nostrils flaring. You always were a mouthy brat. Coulter's finger twitched near the trigger. But before the tension could snap, a shout rang from the distance. Another rider approached. Sheriff Tolan. Coat flapping, badge glinting, face red from the ride. He slid off his horse and put a hand on his belt. Enough. The father turned, surprised. Sheriff, these girls belong to me. The sheriff shook his head. Law says otherwise. You abandoned them. I heard it from 3 witnesses. You left minors tied to a fence. That's desertion. That's cruelty. You got no rights here. I'm their kin. And you're also drunk, broke, and banned from half the county. The father stepped forward, but the sheriff raised his hand. One more step, and I charge you with threatening a household. The man froze, breathing hard. Then he looked at Clara. You think this man's gonna save you? I already saved myself, she said. You just never noticed. That did it. The last thread snapped. The father lunged. Coulter raised his rifle, not to fire, but to block. The butt hit the man's chest hard enough to knock him back. He crumpled on the porch, gasping. One of the hired men drew his pistol, but Ruth had already crossed the space with the paring knife. She didn't strike, just pressed it lightly against his side. You get paid for this? She said coldly. Or are you just stupid? The man looked at his friend. They both backed off. The sheriff cuffed the father, muttering under his breath. As he dragged him back toward the wagon, the man shouted, voice hoarse and broken. You're nothing without me. You'll come crawling back. Clara didn't answer. She didn't have to. Lottie came out onto the porch and took her sister's hand. The wagon disappeared down the trail. With it went the noise, the fear, the shadow that had followed them across counties. Coulter leaned his rifle against the post. Wasn't sure I'd get the shot off in time, he said. Clara looked at him. You didn't need to. He was already losing. They went inside. Ruth made tea with hands still shaking. Lottie drew with a stick on the hearthstones. No one spoke for a long time. Later, as the light turned golden across the floorboards, Clara stepped outside again. The wind had changed. It smelled like sun-warmed grass and dry earth. Safe, maybe for the first time. Coulter was fixing a fence post near the goat pen. She walked to him, quiet as always. I thought you might leave, he said, not looking up. I thought about it. You could. No one blamed you. I know. He stood. Dusted off his hands. Finally looked at her. Why are you still here? She reached into her pocket and pulled something out. A small white flower, half crushed, soft as breath. I picked this yesterday, she said. Didn't know why. Now I do. She placed it in his palm. He stared at it like it held some secret only she understood. You don't owe me anything, he said. No, she replied. But if I stay, maybe I could plant more of these. He looked at her, and something old and tired inside him let go. I'd like that, he said. I know. They stood there as the wind passed between them, not cold anymore. Not even lonesome. The porch light flickered on behind them. Ruth's laughter spilled through the open window. Lottie sang to herself, quiet and sweet. The world, for once, felt like it might not fall apart. Coulter reached for Clara's hand. Not out of need, but out of choice. She let him hold it. That was the morning he chose her, not with a kiss, not with a vow, but with stillness. With presence. With the kind of gaze that said, I see you, I know your storms, and I'm not afraid of them. And she chose him back. Not because he saved her. But because he stayed. Because he stood still. Because he listened when no one else had. Somewhere, the prairie wind carried away the last echo of the man who had tied them to that fence. The land stretched wide and quiet and full of space to grow. And inside the cabin, where once there had only been silence, the sound of a life beginning again took root.